Hello, good evening. Welcome to the last lecture of the semester, actually the last lecture of the academic year. It's my pleasure to introduce Benjamin Bratton. Let me do a little bit of housekeeping in terms of introduction, and then I'll get to it. Benjamin is a professor of visual arts at the University of California, San Diego. His work links philosophy, computer science, art and design, and everything else in between and beyond. He's also a professor of digital design at the European Graduate School in Switzerland, SAS-FI in Switzerland, and visiting faculty at SCI-Arc for this year and for years to come. He's been teaching also on and off in SCI-Arc for the last 12 years or so. He has recently published his two books, and one of them is the main reasons for tonight's lecture and tonight's event. These two books, one is Dispute Plan to Prevent Future Luxury Constitution from Efflux. And the book that he's presenting tonight, and the one that is here by our friends from Hennis and Ingalls, is called The Stack on Software and Sovereignty from MIT Press. This is like the official part. This is the official excuse in many ways why the lecture today and in relation to the book. I wanted to say something else about a couple of things more about Ben. Ben is one of those characters and individuals that is very, very difficult to try to sum up in a brief introduction. I think his interests and his ambitions are so diverse and so field expanders. In many, many ways, his influence, I think, in the school, but I'm talking now on a personal level, his influence in my own work and my own thinking and my own teaching has been enormous and remains. Is one of those guys, when you talk to him, you have the desire to go back and keep working, because he opens a whole series of new possibilities and to see the world in such a way that is sometimes for us designers, we tend to be much more monomaniacs and close readers, in a way that it completely redefines how you think about architecture and design and culture at large. So in many ways, what he's interested in is not easy to define in one singular sentence or on a particular body of work. Is one of those guys which I will say that as time goes by, his work becomes more and more relevant. And the reason why of this is because his provocative, very provocative way of thinking, which he delivers in a very calm and gentleman manner, so sometimes it doesn't come across as abrasive, but his ideas are incredibly provocative and corrosive and aggressive in a level that very, very few thinkers in the contemporary culture can achieve that level of sophistication. So in many ways, for us, it's a pleasure that he's back at SCI-Arc, and it's always fascinating to listen what he has to say. For those of us who we have the fortune to be close to him, I was trying to find a way to do some kind of a light touch, because I know that the topics and the things that Ben is going to talk are incredibly heavy and are incredibly current in the current geopolitics and social territory that we are operating in these times. But I was trying to figure it out how to have like a humorous way to try to explain what is the experience when you go for a dinner or a coffee or a conversation with Ben. And the one I come across, I think it maybe is a little bit unfair, but I think it could be close to what it feels like. It goes along something like this.
If you're looking for a berserk night out in the new New York, I know just the place for you. New York's hottest club is Whimsy. Condemned by GLAAD and the EPA from Ghostbusters. This old, wet Band-Aid found in a jacuzzi is the kind of place that makes you feel weird the next time you see your parents. This place has everything. Kufa hats, congas, MTV's Dan Cortez. And that TV channel at the hotel that's like about the hotel. The vibe inside is strange yet familiar, like when you see billboards for Seinfeld reruns in a Puerto Rican neighborhood. Yo soy Costanza, weeknights at 6:30.
Anyway, a conversation with Ben, it has everything. And architecture has to have everything, and that's, I think, one of the many reasons why we always love to have Ben around. So please join me to welcome Ben Bratton once again to SCI-Arc.
Thank you, Hernan, very much for the introduction. Which I will do my best to live up to. Right. It's really a pleasure to be here and to launch this, to launch the book here at SCI-Arc, which is a place Hernan mentioned I've taught on and off for 12 years or so. 2001, I think it started, and so it really feels like home. A lot of the ideas that have gone into the book were hatched here, and so it really sort of feels like bringing it back home. Some other people that should be acknowledged also, the editor of the book, Doug Seri at MIT Press, Lev Manovich, the editor of the Software Studies series, Jeff Kipnis, who spoke here earlier, has been a big supporter of the book, Roger Friedland, who was instrumental in an earlier version of this, Metahaven, also who designed the cover, which was, believe me, a bit difficult to do with the MIT Press, considering how wonderful their own internal design people are. And also my family, Bruna Mori and Lucian, who's just had his 8th birthdays in the back there somewhere as well, and really deserve the biggest thanks. Okay, so given that these talks are archived, and that those who may be watching this could be sometime in the future, who will be dating us by the references here as well, I want to start with my own litany of sorts of some of the things that we may want to account for. We can start with some recent news. Apple versus the FBI, raising basic issues over state jurisdiction over the cloud, which companies or which devices owned by which citizens can be compelled to be transparent to the government of which states and where. And this one ended in a no decision at this stage, it would seem. Meanwhile, reactionary political imaginaries fantasize about states shoring up their territorial borders on land as well as in the cloud by building fantastic new jurisdictional membranes that would decisively cleave inside from outside, xeno from xenophobe. Meanwhile, transnational ethnic identities draw virtual homelands that overflow existing political borders, but already linked by very real economic, information, and cultural networks, while at the same time, stateless persons and refugees whose formal citizenship doesn't apply in the part of the world in which they seek shelter are still connected to the real social economies through mobile devices that don't care whether they're documented or undocumented or even what that means. And at the same time, some partially imploding states, other partially emerging political economic entities experiment with blockchain-based digital currencies that are perhaps better tuned to these kinds of platform sovereignties, or perhaps not. Meanwhile, Estonia offers an e-residency program to those who wish to work in Estonia for Estonian-based companies that remain physical outside of Estonian land. At the same time, atavistic religious fundamentalists who want to revert the world to a medieval order based on primordial political and sexual superstitions make heavy use of After Effects templates and cloud-based video hosting platforms to articulate their dystopian, utopian vision. While China builds artificial islands near the Spratlys in order to more directly occupy with facts on the ground parts of the South China Sea that otherwise have no ground. While Ethereum is used to program a blockchain currency of energy that would circumvent or augment or even eventually encapsulate existing energy infrastructures, perhaps making finally a currency with a really real standard referent. Meanwhile, Berlin tries to outlaw Airbnb by threatening those who rent out their flats using the service with a 100,000 euro fine, pointing towards a future in which people are forced to use VPNs to access basic cloud services there, like in Beijing. And since Airbnb's servers may be outside of Germany or Europe, the cat and mouse game of jurisdictional three-card Monte ensues. Meanwhile, Microsoft's teenager persona bot turns into a Nazi porn game show after just 24 hours of unsupervised exposure to actual online culture. While Facebook announces a 360-degree camera to shoot VR content for their Oculus Rift platform so as to help turn your social newsfeed into immersive cinema. Meanwhile, Google's AlphaGo AI beats one of the world's best players, seeing patterns and making moves which, as Sidol said, no human could possibly see. Meanwhile, the Highway Transportation Authority says that yes, an AI can legally qualify as a driver of a driverless car, sending insurance agents into a tailspin. While a Bangalore-based Mindtree announces a full IPv6 mesh stack for local and global IoT micronetworks. While China's full-stream push into automation threatens to invert 20 years of rural to urban migration and regional resettlement patterns around coastal factories. And meanwhile, nationalists, localists, and skeptics of various stripes ponder not only the UK's leave from the EU, but perhaps the end of the EU, and if we're really not careful, perhaps the end of anything even resembling an international order. Welcome to the new normal. The Stack, the book, tries to form an image of this whole that sees these things not as a litany of many different exceptions and outliers, but as perhaps the elemental parts of an emergent order, one that is exciting and dangerous, full of positive and negative potentials. The key three things that we may see here is one, a delamination, if you like, of jurisdiction from geography, one operating irrespective of the other. We see how planetary scale computation both distorts and deforms traditional Westphalian logics of the nation state and its political geography and produces new territories in its own image. We see how these various forms and genres of this planetary scale computation should be seen not as a bunch of weird different species all spinning out on their own, but as something forming an accidental megastructure of sorts, which we call the stack. So first, before diving into that, what was the old order, the old system exactly? If we can remember. In an address to the Council of Foreign Relations on the need for a new geopolitical architecture, the outgoing Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, made a rather striking recommendation. We need a new architecture for this new world, more Frank Gehry than formal Greek, unquote. She described the system dominated by the UN, NATO, and other large organizations, and so forth, as equivalent to the classical Parthenon of Athens. By contrast, there's Gehry's architecture. Some of his work might at first appear haphazard, but in fact, it's highly intentional and sophisticated, she said. Where once a few strong columns could hold up the weight of the world, today we need a dynamic mix of materials and structures. Now, looking to contemporary design for new models of geopolitical architecture, both literal structures and figurative systems, may be exactly the right idea. But what drives this demand for a new armatures, new diagrams of global power and sovereignty? In the book, we make considerable use of the term from political theorist Carl Schmitt of the nomos. The nomos is Schmitt's term for how it is that within any political order system, there is first an act of inscription, a way in which the space of the earth is divided up in a particular way. This first line of occupation that cleaves the inside from the outside. The logic of that inscription, of that division, emerges and solidifies into a geopolitical order. The nomos is both that logic of that inscription and the order that ensues. For Schmitt, the nomos is all about the land, not the sea, the opposition, let alone the air, or for that matter, the electromagnetic spectrum. But for us, it's exactly the issue. Anything like a nomos of the cloud doesn't abide by the neat land versus sea versus air distinctions of modern political geography. And so where do we locate sovereignty instead? When I say it's moved past the sort of Westphalian model, what I mean by that is this. The 1648, just to sort of pick a model for this, the Treaty of Westphalia codifies the nation-state model of the circumscription of sovereignty, of subdividing the horizontal plane of the land into little loops, and inside the loops, sovereignty is held. A king, a currency, a flag, a World Cup team, and this loop, and so forth. No territory without topography, no topography without topology. The situation in which we find ourselves today, though, is one not by a further subdivision of loops, but rather a stacking of one order on top of another. Right. Now, Furthermore, none of this ever really held. The Westphalian model tried to sort of hold this order in place, but it itself was always overcome by its own exceptions. Today, we have, in addition to this, the adjacencies and these sort of models of state jurisdiction, also the vertical stacking of interdependent layers on top of each other. Sometimes these two geometries are in cahoot, that is the state geography and the cloud geography. Sometimes they're completely diagonal to one another, sometimes they're totally unrecognizable to one another. But that they both exist at once, they both claim the same site, the same person, the same data, the same flow. This is the new armature. So the model of the stack, to be perfect, is based on software-hardware stacks. It's an old diagram of the OSI stack. So in summary, the way in which the software-hardware stacks, network stacks work like this, the network itself is subdivided into these specific modular layers, specific technologies that do a specific thing. So long as the technology that's situated in that layer is able to talk to the layer above it and the layer below it, it can be anything. It could be copper wire, it could be fiber optic cable, it could be a wireless transmission. And so the stack is set up in a way so that you can't know in advance what a future technological innovation would be. But you don't need to. You can simply pull one technology out and put another one in, and the whole armature works the same. Any user at the top activates the whole thing at once, by application layer all the way down, across, and back up again. And so in every gesture or column up and down that one makes, the user activates the entire system twice, once on the way down and once on the way up. All stacks are platforms, but not all platforms are stacks. And the logic of platforms is actually a really important part of both the political, technological, and design theory of the book. Platforms are based on a rigorous standardization of the scale, duration, and morphology of their essential components. That's how they work. They allow for universalization through the standardization. But because platforms don't work according to pre-existing master plans, they set stage for actions to unfold through ordered emergence. An ideal platform is like an empty diagram through which users might mediate new and archive information. A search engine, for example, does not produce new internet content for its users, but rather structures the value of content that other users produce. Such are platforms. And so the design politics of platforms is characterized by this apparent paradox between the strict imposition of an invariable mechanism. In order to participate, you have to use these protocols, and autocracy of means that provides for an emergent heterogeneity of self-directed uses, a liberty of ends. Anything that abides by the protocols can participate, regardless of any other precedent forms of credentialization, such as citizenship. So next to states and markets, platforms are a third form, coordinating through fixed protocols while scattering free-range users, watched over in loving, if also disconcertingly, omniscient grace. Drawing the interfaces of everyday life into one another, the maximal state and the minimal state start to look weirdly similar. And so this is our accidental megastructure, our stack, the model and the schema, both a technology that is a schematic jurisdictional model, a political geography that also is itself a computational megastructure. And so what I would like to do in the next few minutes is go through some of the existing logic of these layers and some thoughts on what the design problematics of each of them may be. First, the Earth layer. We assume that computation was discovered more than it was invented, and that the forms that we take, the forms in which we encounter computation today are ones that are based not on its virtuality, but on its deep and intrinsic physicality. That the calculation of information through the hardware is a physical event, and that the structure, the whole megastructure of the stack is a vast, hungry, energy-intensive mechanism that in no way should be understood as a problematic of the virtual. It's based not only on silicon, but on other kinds of conflict minerals, heterogeneous minerals pulled from mountain streams in Central Africa that go into all of the electronics that we use. The stack terraforms the host planet by drinking and vomiting its elemental juices and spitting up mobile phones. the shiny surfaces of our handsets demand gore to feed the gloss of its face. And so all of us are carrying around little bits of Africa with us in our pockets. This physical virtual problem and the misrecognition of one for the other is also, to a certain way, why we don't understand the ecological footprint of or understand the ecological consequences of the footprint of the cloud. It's an incredibly hungry physical system that passed the airline industry years ago in terms of its energy usage. It's one of, in its own way, it's arguably one of the key, if you taken as a whole, one of the key agents or causes of climate change. It's also, if you take in all of the satellite systems and sensors and other kinds of mechanisms, it's also the only reason we know that climate change is happening at the level of granularity that we know it to be happening because of this thing. Now, by some estimates, if we continue the use of cloud computing at the rates in which we're doing so, the most likely scenario is a landscape filled with data center-shaped ruins with nothing to power them. In other scenarios, it's precisely because of a more ubiquitous and intensive use of information technology in computing that we can rationalize the use of energy and other resources in such a way that we can continue something like the infrastructures that we want. In other words, we don't know how or whether or not, but whether or not we should be building, whether we can build the stack fast enough to save us from the consequences of building the stack. This is the snake eating its own tail problem of the Earth layer itself. This was kind of brought home to me a few years ago. I did a panel with a guy named Stanley Williams, who's a chip architect at HP, and he was talking about a project he was working on with then Vice President Gore, who had commissioned a bunch of researchers such as himself to come up with a plan for a computer that could model the entire Earth's climate in real time. What would it take to engineer this sort of machine? And what the panel concluded was that it was possible to do theoretically. It would require zettabyte computation, which was a few orders of magnitude above what's still available, but that the computer itself would be roughly the size of Paris, and it would be the single most significant anthropogenic energy event that it itself would be modeling. This is the conundrum of the Earth layer of the stack. Okay, to the cloud. Right. As said, the cloud itself is not numinous. It is a specific vast infrastructure. It has more in common with SuperStudio's continuous monument or Arkazoom's no-stop city than it does with water vapor or floating immateriality. It also has geography. The platforms of the cloud layer of the stack are structured by dense, plural, and non-contiguous geographies, a hybrid of USA superjurisdictions and the charter cities which would carve new, partially privatized polities from the whole cloth of these sovereign lands. But perhaps there's more there. It's also fundamentally rural in a lot of ways. We tend to think of the cloud as something that happens in the center of the city, but most of the data centers, the key centers of its supply chain and logistic archipelagos dot the rural landscape, not the urban landscape. But it not only dots our geography and fills it up, it also produces it in weird ways. As you will recall this incident a few years ago where someone at Google shifted the boundary between Nicaragua and Costa Rica in response when Nicaragua mobilized its army and occupied the land that Google had bequeathed it from Costa Rica. A few phone calls were made and cooler heads prevailed. But from here we see that our contemporary cloud platforms are displacing, if not also replacing, traditional core functions of states and demonstrating for both good and ill new spatial and temporal models of politics and publics. The larger geographical drama is seen perhaps most explicitly in the ongoing Sino-Google conflicts of 2008 to the present. China hacking Google, Google pulling out of China, the NSA hacking China, the NSA hacking Google, Google ghostwriting books for the State Department, and Google wordlessly circumventing the last instances of state oversight altogether, not by transgressing them, but by absorbing them into its service offering. Meanwhile, Chinese router firmware bides its time. Or consider the words of Fan Bingjing, one of the chief architects of the so-called Great Firewall. It's like the relationship between riverbed and water. Water has no nationality, but riverbeds are sovereign territories. We cannot allow polluted water from other nations to enter our country, speaking of Google. And so as said, two geographies at work, and those geographies are often quite weird. Another example, consider Google's filed patents for offshore data centers to be built in international waters, on towers using tidal currents and available water to keep their servers cool. The complexities of jurisdiction suggested by a global cloud piped in from non-state space are fantastic, but they're now less exceptional than they are exemplary of that new normal. Between the hackers of the People's Liberation Army and Google, there's more than a standoff between the proxies of two-state apparatuses. There is rather a fundamental conflict over the geometry of political geography itself. One bound by the territorial integrity of the state, and the other by the gossamer threads of the world's information demanding to be organized and made useful, as Google's motto would have it. This is a clash between two logics of governance. Or, for example, in India and Pakistan, where they both share this border in the Himalayas, where India puts sensors to measure the changing shift in the ice pack on one side, Pakistan's put sensors to shift the ice on the other. The ice, of course, doesn't know where it is, and over the course of the season slides back and forth. What you see happening is that Pakistan will claim the territory where its sensors end up in the shifted ice. India claims the territory where its sensors shifted up in the ice. And so the capacity to sense the territory actually produces the sovereign claim over that site, not the other way around. And so these multiple geometries of territory, one a subdivision of the horizontal, the other a stacking of vertical layers. One the state, the other a parastate, one superimposed on top of the other at any point in the map, and never resolved into some consensual cosmopolitanism. So we move up. Tilting our eyes slightly higher, we see in this total image that urban fabric we inhabit has shifted from hunter-gatherer landscapes to sedentary fortresses, back to itinerant mobilities, between enclaves and exclaves, linking not just points within one city, but all cities in a kind of discontiguous grid. Touchpoint by touchpoint, the city layers perhaps where the birth pangs of stacked geopolitics are felt most viscerally. The arrival of any political constitution is accompanied by a corresponding political violence. And this is no less true of planetary scale computation and the jurisdictions emerging in its interfacial networks. But unlike modern political states that may have exploded into being by the breaching or establishment of specific symbolic centers, the constitutional violence of planetary computation's platform sovereignties occur at the surface of the entire city, in and on every object seemingly all at once, as ubiquitous and convergent as it is partial and partitional. So the city layer of the stack comprises the environment of discontiguous megacities and meganetworks that situate both settlement and mobility in combined physical and virtual envelopes. These partition and subdivide access to urban space, but in their generic comprehensiveness, they may also provide for forms of accidental cosmopolitanism, ones derived not from parliamentary certificates, but from a shared physical relationship to ubiquitous infrastructure. And under those circumstances, the plasticity of sovereignty, not only on individual privacy, but also on the valuation of plural motion, gesture, and movement, is the basis of fabricated polities. One axis of innovation is between the rights and responsibilities that the urban interface gives to and demands from a user who is a formal legal citizen of its explicit jurisdiction, versus those it gives to and demands from a user who is not. We may find that in the future, the non-citizen may in some ways enjoy certain advantages over the citizen, as infrastructures may not already be pre-programmed to govern that user directly as a formal subject, but merely to transact services with her. Some designers, often architects, may see software as something added onto space. They may see the idea, therefore, of smart cities as essentially stupid because the notion itself already assumes that cities are not already intelligent. And they're right. Other designers, perhaps programmers, may see cities as modules of hardware that fit together, one at a time, into that distributed megastructural matrix. And they too are right. And so one mode of design is ultimately, eventually, nested inside the other. Cities defined in this way, with perspectives mixed from both public health planning, supply chain logistics, and urban systems, are infrastructure for living and non-living matter to consume itself, and for some forms of matter to achieve and hone sentient intelligence, which in turn remakes cities in its image. It's also then home for emergent urban-scale AI. The AI city may be embodying itself, but not as humans do. A commingling of diverse sensors of light and air, and sound and chemistry draws a landscape of sensing and thinking little species, partially embodied discretely one in with another, and partially co-embodied with one another as their information inputs are aggregated, modeled, and acted upon in various pluralities. In short, we should imagine an AI urbanism in terms of Geopolitical's stroll into the field populated by intermingling, mutually oblivious little life worlds, or in terms of Deleuze's parable of the tick, the latter laying in wait for some threshold event to come its way, at which point it triggers a pre-programmed response at and into its own little void. Many of our urban sensors and their limited forms of AI work similarly and with similar nobility. More versatile synthetic intelligences occupy more complex Umwelt. Some are predator, some are prey, some are in motion, some are flowering, some are pollinating. And as we stroll among them, we may be registered by them, or we may be ignored. We may be the primary cause of concern, or we may be a passing interference in an evolutionary dynamic in which we are neither protagonist nor target. Homo sapiens comes equipped with an extraordinary array of sensory faculties, which may be augmented by various synthetic layers in various ratios, ranging from the sensors and trackers in our phones that we carry about like mules, to more intimate media of artificial images and sounds. Situating ourselves in this expanded field, we are both sensors and sensed. The work of abstraction for urbanism, then, is not only to deploy abstract forms, but to set in motion mechanisms and programs that are capable of their own feats of abstraction and to calibrate how they abstract us and one another accordingly. Up a layer to the address layer. Swirling just closer to the top of the image, we see that any instance, singular or plural, of matter, particle or wave, is potentially identified by universal addressing systems in which mapping and linking is tooled at the scale of an Avogadro's number of addresses, allotted theoretically to every user. The global credential of the address subdivides heterogeneous territories, hard and soft, Hertzian space and carbon space, into a disintegrated communicative array, an atmospheric metropolis built of digit strings. Because for something to appear to the stack, to participate in its platform logic, it must be addressed. It must be nominated and enumerated as something that can speak and be spoken to. Its position is thus one of both a mapping problem and of set theory. Interesting then that by at least one definition of allocations of IP4 address blocks to RERs, we've run out of addresses. One solution to the scarcity of IPv4 addresses are IPv6 addresses, which, for the sake of argument, as a 128-bit address string, would theoretically allocate something of the order of 10 to the 23 addresses to every person on Earth. IPv4 is about 4 billion addresses, theoretical space. IPv6 is obviously much, much larger. Now, what do you do with 10 to the 23 addresses? It's an incomprehensibly large number. If you wanted to allocate a discrete IP address to every single thing you ever came in contact with over the course of your life, you would never, ever exhaust 10 to the 23 addresses. You'd have to be working down to the scale of individual cells and molecules in the things that you encounter. But if you were to assign an address to not to the thing itself, but to your relation to that thing, the bottle of water has an address, but the fact that it's in front of me, a fact that has no mass, has no materiality, this relation could have an address. And then where the water comes from, where the source of the plastic comes from, and so forth and so on. The relations of relations of relations growing exponentially. You could exhaust this allocation all but instantaneously. So somewhere between never and instantaneously is the design space of the address layer. And in this addressability of physical objects withdrawn into their specific enumeration, itself then overmatched by the abstract relations between objects. They're compositing and sorting into higher order sets, all of which are addressed and which address one another by a process that is itself addressed by them, meta-addressing all the way down into the abyss. And importantly, this deep address is then not only a mechanism for the capture of what exists, a formalization and a space of juxtaposition, it's also a medium for the creative composition of those traces and positions and the interrelation between these across natural scale and temporality, drawing otherwise illegible forms into a wider internet of hiacities. It's a mapping problem, but it's also then a set theory problem. What is related to what and what is inside of what? Arguably, one of the problems of the financial crisis of 2008, figuring out where anything was, what were related to anything else, demonstrates that the granularity of our current mapping system is probably due for an update. Now, the prospect of an addressing map that's capable of, that is capable of addressing the things in the world, the material relations between things in the world at this level of granularity is, of course, disconcerting for obvious reasons. The capacity to nominate and enumerate and to capture in this way provides for, is in a certain sort of way, an image of totalitarianism at a molecular scale. But it may be that, in a certain way, that the compulsion to appear to ubiquitous computation in this way also guarantees the disappearance of those things as they're provided to the unvisible alternatives and addressable landscapes. That is, it may be that the solution to the closure of one totality is not only the undermining of their totality, but the introduction of an additional totality. Multiple totalities, one on top of another, sometimes not even knowing the other one even exists. Multiple systems addressing the different things in different ways. And so again, it's this vertical stacking of interdependent layers, one on top of another, two geometries, sometimes in cahoots, sometimes diagonal or unrecognizable to one another. To the interface layer. Early in the coevolution of our anatomy and our technologies, hands have been a primary interface to the world and how we grasp things and how we go forth with them. And as we started to build computers, augmenting and prostheticizing the hands, Douglas Engelbart's first mouse, became an obvious priority to grab and to point, to click and to indicate through the hand in this particular kind of way. Just because my son is here, it's his birthday yesterday, I wanted to embarrass him. This is from when he was about 1 year old. The pictures of him when he found this clicker in our home office at home and sat there for about an hour and a half, turning the light on and the fan on and off in the office. He had discovered this fundamental thing about some objects in the world, that when you manipulate them, they cause some other object in the world to do something in this spooky distance within 12. And then, like a lot of kids, he went on this button-pushing mania for the next few years as well. Today, the dominant mode of the interface that we have is the GUI, the graphical user interface. Earlier hand-based tools may have passed for a moment into a kind of iconic point-and-click models of the interface, such that the diagrams that we have of how the systems work not only describe that system, they actually do the thing that they represent once they're manipulated. You click on the button, the image of the bomb, and a bomb actually happens. And so we are all a species now of button pushers, buttons with words on them. It's how we interact with the stack and how the stack interacts with us. And in cumulation, as they multiply, interfaces assemble into interfacial regimes which present and enforce synthetic, diagrammatic, total images of how the entire platform can work for a user who perceives that platform through the grammar of that same machine. In other words, The complexity of the stack, of everything you could do with it through a particular interface, is more than anyone could think, more than anyone could comprehend. And so the interface is the inevitably synthetic reduction of all of those possibilities into array, tells us what there is there and what there is to do with it. Now, the diagrammatic image instrument interface of the GUI is one thing, but VR and AR is perhaps virtual reality and augmented reality is perhaps quite another. With GUI, there is at least some space between the interface and what it represents. The naturalistic synthesis of cognition and interfaciality in this space, this metaphorical space between icon and what is represented, between the interface and the platform of interfaces. With VR and AR, that space of representation begins to implode. We begin to actually see the interfacial regimes not as something in the world, but as something literally laminated or superimposed upon the world. And so subsequently, some platform totalities are drawn into a theologic projection for which the work of anamnesis is externalized into perceptual and instrumental events, which provide both the signification and the significance of objects and events, as well as the terms of encounter that the user should have with them. The most imminent accident of augmented reality is, I suppose, a deeply granular and pervasive advertising by which our embodied perceptions and gestures generate the monetizable exchange value of the network user profile. AR is perhaps where the micro-targeting business models of cognitive capitalism melt into the choreography of the mobile user subject. And the work that user subject already does to perfect targeting algorithms for search engines can be scaled from finger points and clicks all the way up to the very musculature and dance of dwelling itself. I'll just let this play out. So it's basically drugs. However, I fear that ultimately a less secular danger is latent in AR, especially VR as well, but perhaps AR even more so, and that the killer app is not marketing, but fundamentalist religion of some sort, various sorts. AR promises the design of a differential sacrality, whereby the Manichaean political theological segmentation of the polis into friend and enemy becomes a direct and literal annotation of the life world itself, the subtitling of clean and unclean, ours and theirs, sacred and profane, empire and rebel forces, orc and not orc, red team and blue team. We fear a militarization of cognition itself as atavistic fundamentalisms move into the direct augmentation of reality and new political theologies emerge alongside them. This is, again, totalities layered on top of totalities. But here, in the elemental terms of their superimposition, is the catechism of war. But of course, that's not the only path possible. It may also allow for, one hopes, forms of empathetic, cinematic co-experience we can scarcely imagine, allowing for co-embodied users across locations and for the induction and deduction of far more complex information flows, such as between energy and currency, into a matter of normal course. Oh, then to the sixth of the layers of the stack, the user layer, where most of us spend our time. One of the useful paradoxes of the user's position as a political subject is the contradictory impulse directed simultaneously towards an artificial over-individuation and its ultimate pluralization, while both participating differently in the geopolitics of transparency. We require, I argue, a real redefinition of the political subject in relationship to the real operations of the user, because it's all quite weirder than our current vocabulary will ultimately allow for. This definition should focus on composing and elevating sites of governance from the immediate and suturing material, the interfacial material between subjects, and in the stitches and the traces and the folds of interaction between bodies and things at a distance, congealing into different networks demanding very different kinds of platform sovereignty. Among these is the fact that as far as the stack is concerned, anybody or anything can be a user: animal, vegetable, mineral, high-tech trading algorithms, Madagascar hitching cockroaches. Platforms ultimately don't care if what phylum the user belongs to or whether or not they contain carbon atoms. All users may have platform sovereignty. In security speak, a user is qualified by 3 qualifications: something you know, like a password; something you are, like a fingerprint; something you have, like a key card. So, if someone or something can be, have, and know, it can be a user. A trading algorithm, a driverless car, a sandpaper arrivé, a chemical reaction triggering a threshold reaction in an environmental sensor embedded on a leaf in a rainforest, all users. And it's the generic universality of platforms that makes them formally open to users, human and non-human. If the user's actions are interoperable with the protocols of the platform, then in principle it can communicate with its systems and its economies. For this, platforms generate user identities, whether they're desired or not. Anything that can initiate interactions with the platform can be a user, and the platform may see them and interact with them back without knowing or caring who they are or what they are. Platforms don't care if the state sees you as an illegal immigrant or if the market sees you as a negative externality. The user is an open position. And so to develop the political and economic design model for the stack to come is thereby inseparable, I think, from the philosophical and technological reconception of the human as a kind of user, and of the user as something that is not necessarily human. You may recall about this time last year, Google's Deep Dream program began to make the news, an algorithm that was trained to find faces of dogs and things. The research team did a project with this where they ran a sort of find edges filter on these pictures, fed it the pictures, told it to find the dog face, fed it back in again over and over and over and over and over. The AI begins to hallucinate dog faces where dog faces don't normally see. One of the amazing things about Deep Dream, it sort of seems to me, is not only the fact that AIs are capable of apophenia and this kinds of hallucinations as well, but it's the exercise of sort of seeing the way the world through the eyes of this rather bizarre form of intelligence. Instead of thinking of AI in terms of the human, like the Turing test does, it's intelligent if it will behave as though it thinks the way humans think. The real issue is to understand it in a certain sort of way, is to learn to think in whatever sort of incomplete way amongst these other forms of intelligence. It also should, in a certain way, shift some of the things we think about Google, or at least expand them in a way. That is, if the Deep Dream images are artifacts of a computer's hallucination and phantom conclusions, then the conspiratorial figure of evil Google stepfather is perhaps that same paranoid vision turned inside out, back on itself. Perhaps Google, the AI, is as paranoid in how it sees us as some of us are in how we see it. It's not perhaps then coincidental or surprising that as the AI matures, its own pattern recognition faculties would reach the plateau of this creative apophenia. Now, expanding this position, the subject position of this global infrastructure, away from in such a ways that it undermines to a certain degree the special snowflake status of humans or humanism, is certain to, and already does, provoke extraordinary pushback. Some of it as fervent as it is irrational. There are, for example, some affinities with certain technologies, however fictitious or bizarre those affinities may be, that are thought to embody the essence of a kind of creationist order, on the one hand, food, or of personal human mastery, such as the car. Based on some discussions I have with some friends who are former students who are now at Google X, I would go so far as to predict that there would in time be a movement to identify human-driven automobiles as a type of arms, and that the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, now used to shield gun owners from obvious liabilities and to protect their sense of personal dominion, will be flown to keep human beings behind steering wheels. In other words, your life may be ended by someone encased in a 2-ton steel box careening down the asphalt vista, trying to prove a point about how technology will never capture his natural humanity. So while this stages the death of the user in one sense, the eclipse of a certain resolute humanism, it does so because it also brings the multiplication and proliferation of other kinds of non-human, inhuman, and exohuman users, including sensors and algorithms and robots and from nanometric to landscape scale, into the mix, any combination of which one of us may enter into a relationship as part of a composite user. Okay. Lastly, perhaps most importantly, the stack to come. As said, the rationale of the model of the stack is that whatever exists in any one layer not only might be replaced, but is in the process of inevitably being replaced. This mechanism is set up so that the form remains as the content churns. I was also surprised, and which would imply we need not one stack theory with multiple. You imagine my surprise when, after the book had gone to press, someone sent me a slide from one of the NSA PowerPoints that Der Spiegel published. It turns out the NSA are also stack theorists. They have a geographic, physical layer, large network, cyber persona, and persona layer as well. They almost got it right, but we can come back to them a little bit later. So thinking now about the stack to come, looking askance at our idiot predicaments of today, we can well wonder whether our current faculties of analysis and making, our hideous languages, are actually even capable of authoring any lasting alternatives. But in some ways, design always does its best work in relationship to an emergency. Now we have lots to sort of pick from: ecological emergencies, securitarian emergencies, financial emergencies. So take your pick. Among these, maybe arguably some that in terms of a version of this we may well avoid, we might call cloud feudalism. Cloud feudalism could be understood as the particular distribution of power between central and commanding platform services and quasi-autonomous, if relatively powerless, network clients, as applied to human economics. Others have articulated the problems associated with these sorts of arrangements, their deflationary impact on demand-side growth, and their ultimate macroeconomic instability, not to mention the social inequity. Now, the critique of infrastructure is essential, but it must also rotate ultimately into infrastructure scale design, if it is serious and not just posturing. For this, it's useful, I think, to think in terms of totalities, such as the stack, because they provide a way to see the interrelationships of distributed agency, subjectivity, causality, in effect, all at once. The Anthropocene is not just then, should be understood not just then as the reign of humans. And my point about post-humanism and the non-human user is not an anti-human position. I said some of my best friends are humans. The Anthropocene should be seen also in terms of the reign of a certain kind of humanism. And to survive it, we must graduate beyond the notion that the human experience of human experience is A, the central purpose of the world given there for us, and B, something that is separate from our own biotechnological evolutionary emergence, itself ongoing. Unfortunately, our humanist hangover, ultimately a folk psychology that weaves asceticism, solipsism, and various naturalistic fallacies into a political aesthetics, is to me more a theologic expression of a mode of global dwelling that sees the world as here for us. this humanist exceptionalism, this is the exact recipe of the Anthropocene. And in the fetishization of human experience, it makes it far too difficult to see the geodesign project, which we're all participating, for what it should be. More like molecular gastronomy at landscape scale, a restored and resorted ecology designed to taste itself in new forms of richly spiced and imaginatively sauced mutual ingestion. The relationship of humanities and theory to technology and engineering inevitably will have to shift a bit. The things that we take as being sort of the domain of science and engineering, science is a method, it's not a subject matter. And so it's all the types of things, where the kinds of biological and technological operations existing in these engineering skills are equally available to humanities and theory, and the counter-incursion could occur. Instead of a form of relationship of theory to design, in which philosophy comes up with concepts and models, and then design makes things in the images of these models, we need, I think, in many ways to revert this. Today, in many ways, our technical engineering capacity has produced forms of knowledges and insights for which our inherited philosophical equipment is inadequate to do the job. And so the job now, in many ways, is to invent and innovate the conceptual tools that are needed. In other words, it's philosophy from design, not design in the image of philosophy. Or put differently, Copernican traumas that abolish the false centrality and specialness of human thought and species being are priceless accomplishments. The advent of robust inhuman AI and the geopolitics that could ensue from it, if we are willing to compose it, will provide for similar disenchantments, one that should enable a more reality-based understanding of ourselves, our situation, and a fuller and more complex understanding of what intelligence is and is not, a broader space. And from there, we can hopefully make the world with greater confidence that our models are good approximations of what's actually out there, always a helpful thing. I want to conclude then with some last thoughts on the stack that we have and what we could call the black stack, a kind of generic figure for the stack to come. It's multiple alternative totalities that we in some ways are both, there's some ways inevitable but unknowable. The stack we have is defined not only by its form, its layers and platforms and their interrelations, but also by its content. And as is now painfully clear, leak after leak, that content is also the content of our daily communications, now weaponized against us. If the panopticon effect is when you don't know if you're being watched or not, and so you behave as though you are, then the inverse panopticon effect is when you know you're being watched, but act as if you aren't. This is today's surveillance culture, exhibitionism in bad faith. The emergence of stack platforms doesn't promise any solution or even distinctions between friend and enemy within this optical geopolitics. At some dark day in the future, when considered versus the Google caliphate, the NSA may even come to be seen as some form of the public option. At least it's accountable in principle to some parliamentary limits, they may say, rather than merely stockholder avarice and flimsy user agreements. If we take 9/11 as the rollout and the rollout of the Patriot Act as sort of the year zero for the USA's massive data gathering, encapsulation, and digestion campaign, one that we're only now beginning to comprehend, even as parallel projects from China and Russia and Europe come to light, then we could imagine the entirety of network communication for the last decade, the big haul, as a single deep and wide digital simulation of the world, or a significant section of it. It's an archive, a library of the real, and its existence as the purloined property of the state, just as a physical fact, is almost occult, almost. The geophilosophical profile of this big haul, from the energy necessary to preserve it to its governing instrumentality, understood as both a text, a very large text. And as a machine with various utilities, this overflows the traditional politics of software. Its story is much more Borges than Lawrence Lessig, and its fate is as well. Can it be destroyed? Is it possible to delete this simulation, and is it even desirable to do so? Is there a trash can big enough for the big delete? And even if the plug could be pulled on all future data halls, stopping it all immediately, surely there must be a backup somewhere, the identical double of the simulation, such that if we delete one, the other will be forever haunting history until it's rediscovered by future AI archaeologists interested in their own Paleolithic origins. Would we bury it, even if we could? Would we need signs around it, like those designed for the Yucca Mountain nuclear waste disposal site, warning off unknowable future excavations? Those of us lucky enough to be alive during this 15-year span would enjoy a certain illegible immortality, curious to whatever metacognitive entity pieces us back together by our online activities, both public and private, proud and furtive, each of us rising back centuries from now, each of us a little Ozymandias of cat videos and Pornhub. For some dramas, but hopefully not for the fabrication of the stack to come, black or otherwise, a certain humanism and companion figure of humanity still presumes its traditional place in the center of the frame. We must let go, I think, of the demand that any AI arriving at sentience or sapience must care about humanity, us specifically, as the subject and object of its knowing and its desire. The real nightmare, in other words, worse than the one in which the big machine wants to kill you, is the one in which it sees you as irrelevant, or not even as a discrete thing to know. Worse than being seen as an enemy is not being seen at all, or as Eliezer Yudkowsky puts it, the AI does not hate you, nor does it love you, but you are made of atoms which it can use for something else. And so one of the integral accidents of the stack may be an anthrocidal trauma that shifts us from a design center as the authors of the Anthropocene to the role of supporting actors in the arrival of a post-Anthropocene. The stack to come may also be black because we cannot see our own reflection in it. In the last instance, its accelerationist geopolitics is less eschatological than chemical, because its grounding of time is based less on the promise of historical dialectics than on the rot of isotope decay. It's drawn, I believe, from an inhuman and inhumanist molecular form finding. Precambrian flora changed into peat oil, changed into children's toys, dinosaurs changed into birds, changed into ceremonial headdresses, computation itself converted into whatever meta machine comes next. The stack into the stack to come. Thank you.